At the beginning of the 11th century, the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru, united the entire island for the first time, keeping the island united until his heroic death against the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf. This narrative is usually one of the first to appear when mentioning Brian Boru, though like all narratives, it's ultimately misleading. Really, Ireland could barely be called united, even at this time, and his campaigns were chiefly to unify this island, instead of driving out foreigners. Unfortunately, these efforts would be in vain. By the turn of the millennium, Ireland had been a part of Christian Europe since the 5th century. However, except for Dublin, Ireland had no bishops like the rest of Western Europe. Instead, powerful monasteries existed throughout the island that were, at this point, an extension of power for the various families that were ruling Ireland at the time. An especially important monastery was at Armagh, arguably the head of Christianity in Ireland. Since the beginning of recorded history in Ireland, the island had been divided into about 8 major kingdoms, these being Ulster, Munster, Connacht, Leinster, Meath, Oriel, Gaelic, and by the mid-9th century, Ossory. Also during the mid-9th century, Danish and Norwegian Vikings established a number of independent cities on the coast of Ireland. The most important of these was Dublin, who also had their own king. Below the kings, a wide variety of powerful families known as clans truly ran Irish society. Each clan ran their own territory within one of the kingdoms, frequently raiding each other and vying for regional supremacy. These clans practiced a system of succession called tanistry. From what I understand, under tanistry, the whole of a family elects a strong leader among themselves, as well as an heir for the leader called a tanist. The leader and tanist did not have to be directly related, but all had to descend from a patrilineal line. As a result, the kingship of these Irish kingdoms usually laid in the hands of the leader of the most powerful clan, and frequently rotated among its different lines. It seems like each clan tried to stem legitimacy by connecting themselves to a number of semi-legendary dynasties, like the Oganachta in Munster and the Connachta in Connacht. Of these dynasties, the most important of them was the Nael. Descendants of Niall of the Nine Hostages, this dynasty held the title of High King of Ireland since the 5th century, the same one which Brian Boru will wrest from them at the turn of the millennium. Despite the prestige of this title, it only ever was that, which meant that there weren't really any institutions in the sense of European monarchies. More importantly for Brian Boru, the Irish kings were under no obligation to follow what he said, and they would make sure to remind Brian of that fact. Brian was born around 941 as part of the Dalcashan clan, a minor clan in Munster, unrelated to the powerful Oganachta clans that ruled the kingdom at the time. Nonetheless, by 978, Brian Boru had done the incredible by becoming king of Munster himself and decisively defeating the Vikings of Limerick. These feats caught the attention of the High King at the time, Mael Niall, who spent the rest of his years fighting with Brian over influence in Ireland. He would lose this fight. By 997, Mael was forced to ally with Brian and recognize his suzerainty over the south of Ireland, and by 1002, Mael was forced to surrender the title of High King of Ireland to him as well, breaking centuries of Nael kingship. The task of Brian was now to have the rest of Ireland submit and recognize him as High King. His opponents became the kings in Ulster and the Canail Nogain king of the northern Nael, Flibertach, who seemed to rebel the second Brian turned his head from him. Regardless, by the end of the decade, these two opponents would be submitted to Brian, only for Brian's downfall to come from the king of Leinster. In 1012, Maelmorda, king of Leinster, rebelled, along with King Sitric of Dublin and Flibertach of the northern Nael. Their decisive defeat at Clontarf in 1014 would greatly reduce the power of all states for years to come. The other side also suffered greatly, though, in the death of Brian Boru and his heir presumptive, Murchad. Thus, Brian's dynasty collapsed, returning the kingship of Munster and the high kingship to their original dynasties. Now, the lack of a clear royal line to the high kingship would bring new competition from all Irish kings over the title of High King of Ireland. The Battle of Clontarf is a staggering success for Brian Boru. Not only have the Leinstermen and their Viking allies been massacred in retreat, but Brian and all his dynasty survived the battle. The same can't be said for the kings of Leinster, the Isles, and Orkney though, who are killed in action. From this point onward, Brian's role in the military almost completely passes over to his sons, Murchad, Donnchad, and Tad. Immediately after the battle, Brian reaches an agreement with Sitric of Dublin, where he will submit his eternal loyalty. Though the future will reveal this only to be words, the battle will seal Dublin's fate as a secondary power in Ireland. The next year, Brian undergoes a brutal campaign against Flabbertag and receives his submission. However, at the same time, Brian's supposed ally, Maelsic Niall, attacks Brian's new ally in Dublin. This will become a growing trend over the next years. Though Brian may be secure in his position as High King, he does not have the power to end the aspirations of the other kings in their quests to reduce the High King's influence, or even take the kingship themselves. Also beyond Brian's control, in 1016, the Norse king Cnut the Great would make himself King of England. His kingship would connect the British Isles closer to the Scandinavian world, and with a powerful king in the Irish throne, a few emissaries will be recorded between the two realms, mainly having to do with ecclesiastical affairs and recognition of each other's power. And so, for the next few years, the Dalcassians were secure in their throne. Monasteries all across Ireland would hail Brian as the one king in the style of other European monarchs. Meanwhile, both Leinster and Dublin would be too weak to exert power after their catastrophic defeats in battle. Of the two Inal kings, Flabbertag is still reeling from his defeats, while Maelsic Niall continues to nominally support Brian and his kingship. However, in 1022, Maelsic Niall dies, and his sons are relegated to obscurity. With his death, Brian and Murchad lose a key ally in exerting power in Ireland, and would once again face rebellious kings in battle. Almost immediately, in 1023, with the aging Brian no longer appearing on campaign, Flabbertag is able to ally with the new King of Meath and the monarchs of Ulster to launch a new revolt against the Dalcassians. Brian's son Donnchad is recorded winning a costly victory in Meath against Flabbertag, who retreats back to his territory. Hearing these news, Brian does the incredible and marches with an army at the age of 83, receiving the peaceful submissions of Meath and Ulster. Brian marches all the way to the monastery at Armagh, possibly in hopes to increase his legitimacy across Ireland. Presumably the next year, another army would march towards Flabbertag. However, that next year, both Murchad and Tad suddenly revolt against Brian and Donnchad, leaving any plans in the dust. Now, sons rebelling against their fathers is not new in Irish history, and a similar situation can be observed during the kingship of a previous High King, Flann Cinna. However, the exact reason for such rebellion is still left to interpretation. It could be that Brian was attempting to reel in Murchad's growing influence, or it could be that Murchad was concerned of the growing power of Donnchad within the family. Or the two may have simply had bad blood with each other. Regardless, a bloody battle among the Dalcassians is recorded in 1025 near Cashel. With the aid of the clans of Connacht and the kings of Limerick, Brian and Donnchad defeat Murchad. Out of this battle, Tad is killed in action, and in some sources, an agreement between Murchad and Brian is reached, where Murchad's son, Tuordelbach, will be sponsored for the Irish throne. However, this seems unlikely based on what will eventually happen. During this disorder among the Dalcassians, Flabbertag convinces the King of Dublin, Sitric Silkbeard, to join his revolt. With a tattered army, Murchad marches to Dublin to face the two in battle, and at a battle near the city, Murchad achieves only a Pyrrhic victory against the two. Though Sitric and Flabbertag will submit, Flabbertag will immediately rebel the following year. At this point, Murchad will not have the resources necessary to carry out another campaign against Flabbertag, and the two will remain at a stalemate for the following years. The next few years of Brian's life were pretty uneventful, which should demonstrate that he had finally achieved the stability he wanted all these years. Though Flabbertag would remain a thorn to his side, the rest of Ireland pretty safely recognized him as the only legitimate king. His staggeringly long reign will finally come to an end in 1030, reigning a total of 28 years as High King. Murchad safely succeeds to the position. However, after Brian's death, Murchad's brother, Duncad, will begin to assert himself as the heir presumptive to him. This will anger Murchad's son, Turtlebach, who was now guaranteed to dispute the throne with Duncad once he asserted himself. Regardless, the next year, Murchad gathers a number of Gaelic and Viking allies and embarks on a decisive campaign against Fleibertach, who has also rallied the kings of Ulster and Leinster to his side. The two fight at an unknown location, where Murchad is finally victorious and routs Fleibertach's army. The aid of Sitric of Dublin was key in achieving victory in this battle, after which Fleibertach would submit to Murchad for good, finally uniting all of Ireland under one High King. By the end of this timeline, Brian Boru's astonishingly long reign will be considered one of the greatest in Irish history. Thanks to Brian's generous donations to Irish monasteries, future histories will paint a fond image of Brian and his dynasty. This new Dalcassian authority would not have been possible without aid from Viking allies from cities like Limerick and Waterford. And so soon enough, Limerick will soon become a future source of power for kings in Ireland, as it will be a reliable recruiting ground for new Norse Gael allies. However, new challenges will also arise in the future too. Murchad is old at this point, and his heir, Turtlebach, is growing assertive just as he had before. The succession of Duncad will be heavily contested by Murchad's son, who himself will turn out to be just as ambitious for the kingship of Ireland as Duncad. Outside of the dynasty, various kings outside of Munster would rise to equal proportions of power, such as those in Leinster, Connacht, and soon enough, Dublin.